He told me my family was cursed, and the only way to save us was $50,000 in cash. I didn't know I was holding a ticking time bomb. It was Thursday, May 4th, 2023, and the spring evening had settled into that humid Atlanta dusk that makes shadows stretch longer than they should. I remember sitting at the edge of my worn leather sofa, the kind I bought when I first opened my vintage car workshop, the leather cracking just enough to remind me of age, responsibility, and decades of labor. My daughter Emily perched on the armrest, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at me with an anxious frown that mirrored my own unease. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. The first sign something was off wasn't the words he spoke, it was the way the candle flickered. My son-in-law, Jason, had brought this tiny blackened candle from somewhere. Its flame wavered in a peculiar rhythm as though it hesitated, almost aware of the dread that would follow. He placed it on the coffee table between us, along with a crumpled bank slip and a neatly folded set of instructions, scribbled on thin, yellowed paper. The faint, acrid scent of herbs and something vaguely metallic wafted from the envelope of ritual objects he had carried, like burnt sage mixed with old coins. "Robert," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "Our family is cursed. This isn't superstition. Your family's future, your daughter's safety depends on this ritual." He tapped the slip, emphasizing the $50,000 written in blue ink. $50,000 in cash, no exceptions. The ritual must begin tonight. I stared at the figure as if it might leap off the paper. $50,000 was the sum of our life savings, the emergency fund I had tucked away for years, counting each deposit like a small victory against time. My fingers traced the crumpled edges of the receipt, dated May 3rd, 2023, just yesterday, the day I had banked the last chunk from the workshop's earnings. It felt unreal. Emily's eyes were wide, reflecting the dim flicker of the candle. "Dad, do we really have a curse?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, small and fragile. I wanted to scoff, to reassure her with logic, to pull her close and say, "Nothing can touch us." But there was a weight in Jason's stare, the kind of cold certainty that made even rational men question themselves. Before I could respond, I paused, feeling the camera of my mind shift. This moment, this conversation needed framing. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I muttered to the empty living room, as if speaking aloud would anchor my sanity. It was a habit I had picked up from watching countless confessional stories, each one warning me the line between belief and manipulation is thinner than we think. Jason began laying out the ritual, a series of steps, each seemingly innocuous: lighting candles, arranging herbs, chanting phrases that sounded like broken Latin, and placing small labeled jars around the room. The jars were smooth glass, cold and heavy in my hands, some with thick, dark liquids that smelled faintly of vinegar and ash. But the air shifted. I could feel it. Shadows lengthened and quivered along the walls, the quiet hum of the spring wind outside mixing with the faint rustle of paper as he handed me a contract, notarized supposedly by someone named Father Lorenzo. The signature was scrawled, heavy, almost trembling. I picked up the contract, tracing the lines with my finger. The words promised protection, a removal of the curse, and a lifetime guarantee of familial safety. It was elegant in its deception. At the bottom, a clause required immediate payment, cash, no checks, no bank transfer. $50,000 in $100 bills. My pulse quickened, a subtle rhythm of fear, suspicion, and the haunting sense of responsibility for Emily's safety. I moved to the counter to retrieve my checkbook, then paused. Logic battled superstition. My life had been grounded in tools, engines, and the tangible wrenches, spark plugs, receipts. But now I was being asked to perform an intangible transaction. Faith versus fraud, fear versus reason. I retrieved my wallet, counting the bills one by one. The rustle of paper filled the room alongside the candle's whispering flicker. $50,000. I tucked the bills into the envelope Jason had handed me. As I did, I noticed something peculiar. The candlelight reflected oddly on one of the jars he had brought. The label read Protector's Essence, but the handwriting was not Jason's. It was faintly smudged, almost childish, like someone had copied it from a guidebook. I hesitated. My instincts screamed that something was amiss, but Emily's anxious gaze anchored me. Her trust, her hope, made indecision impossible. I slid the envelope across the coffee table. Jason's eyes softened into a practiced smile. "Good," he said. "Tonight your family will be safe." The words echoed hollowly. "Safe," he said. But in that moment, as I watched him light another candle and arrange the jars, I realized the room itself seemed to breathe, a slow, almost imperceptible inhalation of deceit. I could see my reflection in the polished wood of the coffee table, a father, protective, fearful, and ready to do anything to shield his daughter. Later, when Jason left, the ritual incomplete, I sat alone with Emily, the envelope of cash now in my drawer, underlined by the receipt that would serve as the first thread in a tapestry I didn't yet understand. The shadows seemed to linger, the candle's flame still flickering in memory. My mind raced. What had I just paid for? A curse or a cleverly laid trap? I checked the envelope again, confirming every bill matched the receipt. May 4th, 2023, $50,000. The ledger of life savings now marked a line that would forever tie me to that evening. Emily had gone to her room, clutching her blanket, muttering prayers that felt foreign to me, and I remained on the sofa, turning the crumpled bank slip over and over in my hands, each fold a knot in my stomach. By 10:47 p.m., I had documented everything. The contract scanned, a photo of the envelope with the bills, and a quick voice note describing the scene. My rational mind whispered caution. Every rational instinct, every experience running a business for decades, screamed that something was deeply wrong. I lay awake that night, listening to the spring wind rustling through the blinds, imagining shadows moving along the walls like silent witnesses. I tried to convince myself perhaps this was superstition, perhaps my fear was irrational. But the weight of the cash, the contract, the candle's flicker, they were tangible. They were proof that I had crossed a line, invested faith and funds into a ritual, orchestrated by someone whose intentions I now questioned, but could not yet prove. I resolved then I would watch, observe, and document. Every jar, every candle, every incantation would be noted. If the curse was real, so be it. But if deception hid behind ritual and shadow, I would uncover it. And in that moment, the gut punch of betrayal, the realization that my own family could be manipulated for $50,000, settled like ice in my chest. By the time I closed my eyes, the envelope was tucked safely under the top drawer, the crumpled receipt on the counter. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside, a storm had begun. I didn't know then that this storm would become an intricate dance of fear, patience, and eventual justice. The first night had barely ended, and the echoes of Jason's warning still lingered in my living room. It was Friday, May 5th, 2023, and spring in Atlanta carried that uneasy warmth that made shadows feel heavy, almost sentient. I had barely slept. Every creak of the house, every sigh of the wind, made my pulse tighten. Emily's bedroom door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I could hear her muttering prayers under her breath, the kind she had learned at school, but tonight they sounded tremulous, desperate, like she was bargaining with the darkness itself. I slipped on my slippers, the leather soles soft against the hardwood, and walked quietly toward the living room. The ritual objects Jason had left behind were still there. The jars, the blackened candle, the thin strips of parchment with faded writing. I could smell the faint tang of herbs and something darker beneath it, like burnt resin mixed with candle soot. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally as if watching me. I sat at the edge of the coffee table, running my fingers along the smooth glass jars. One contained a dark liquid, viscous and strangely reflective, almost like it had absorbed the dim light into itself. Another had tiny bones, no larger than a finger joint, encased in clear resin. I shivered, realizing that even in their stillness they seemed almost alive. I pulled out my notebook and began documenting everything. Every object, every detail, dates, textures, labels, slight imperfections. Each jar, each candle placement, every shadow cast was logged meticulously. I couldn't shake the sensation that the objects were shifting subtly when I wasn't looking. The black candle flickered without breeze, and I swear the flame twisted toward me like it was aware of my scrutiny. At 12:17 a.m., I heard the first whisper, a barely audible rustle, like paper brushing against paper. I froze, heart thudding. Emily was asleep, yet her blanket moved slightly, as though touched by some unseen hand. I checked the digital clock, 12:18 a.m. The whisper came again, soft, almost melodic, but tinged with menace. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or the house settling or something else. I reached for my phone and replayed the small voice memo I had recorded the night before. Jason's voice echoed, calm and precise. "Tonight your family will be safe." But underneath there was a faint, almost imperceptible hiss, like a second voice whispering between his words. Goosebumps ran up my arms. Unable to stay seated, I moved through the house, checking locks, confirming windows, and running my hands over door handles. Everything seemed normal, yet I couldn't shake the unease that the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. The faint creak of the floorboards echoed like a footstep, though I was alone. By 2:03 a.m., I returned to the living room. The jars were unchanged, or so I thought. One had shifted slightly, the liquid within rippling as if disturbed. I took a photo, comparing it to the previous one on my phone. The change was minimal, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed what my instincts had been telling me: something was off. I left the lights dimmed and returned to my bedroom, documenting everything in my notes. Subtle movements, strange sounds, shifts in shadows. Sleep was a distant memory. Every faint creak, every sigh of wind made my imagination spiral, linking back to Jason's words, the contract, the $50,000. Fear intertwined with rational doubt. Was this superstition, or had I been caught in a carefully crafted trap? At 4:27 a.m., a sudden metallic clang jolted me awake. I bolted upright, scanning the room. The ritual jars had shifted again, one now resting slightly angled on the coffee table. No wind, no pets. Nothing should have moved it. My pulse hammered. I snapped a photo for evidence, hands shaking. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds. Emily stirred, murmuring prayers as she awoke. I showed her the photos, explaining quietly, "I don't know if this is real, Emily, but I will protect you no matter what. And I'll prove it." Her eyes met mine, fear giving way to trust. By 7:15 a.m., I had compiled a detailed record: photos, notes on subtle shifts, timestamps, and observations of the objects. The ritual was more than superstition. It was manipulation, psychological leverage against my family. Every whisper, every creak, every flicker of candlelight became data, evidence. My rational mind began plotting next steps, documenting further, gathering proof, uncovering the truth behind Jason's claim. And in that quiet, tension-filled morning, I realized this was no longer just about fear. It was about vigilance, preparation, and laying the groundwork for what I now suspected would be a confrontation far more calculated than any ritual could achieve. The house was silent, but the whispers remained in memory, in documentation, in shadow. And I knew that the game had truly begun. By Saturday morning, May 6, 2023, the air in our Atlanta home had grown heavy with unease. Emily had returned from school, still jittery, her eyes darting to the corner where the jars rested on the coffee table. She had not touched them, but the small, protective rituals she performed at her desk, crossing herself, whispering under her breath, spoke volumes about the anxiety Jason had planted in her mind. I had made a decision. Observing from a distance was no longer enough. I needed hard evidence, something tangible to prove that this supposed curse was nothing more than a calculated deception. That morning, a package arrived at my doorstep, plain brown, no return address. The label read "The Ritual Box." Immediate use instructions included. I didn't open it immediately. I waited for Emily to be at school and Jason to be away for errands, timing my investigation with precision. Inside, the contents were carefully arranged: 3 jars filled with dark liquids, a bundle of parchment charts with cryptic symbols, and 4 candles, each blackened at the wick tip, smelling faintly of herbs and something metallic, almost iron-like. A small vial of powder, fine and gray, sat in velvet-lined packaging. The attention to presentation was meticulous, yet something about it struck me as unnatural, too perfect, too staged. Each item seemed designed to provoke awe and fear. I began photographing every piece, noting weights, labels, and inconsistencies. One jar had protector's essence again, but the handwriting was different from the first jar. Another, labeled barrier blood, was faintly smudged, as though rushed or copied. Dates were inconsistent. Some claimed preparation in March, others in April. Each discrepancy fueled my suspicion. Every detail was documented in my notebook, cross-referenced with the previous day's observations. By mid-morning, I had engaged a private investigator I had known for years. Marcus, methodical and discreet, agreed to follow Jason without alerting him. Marcus confirmed a plan: gather visual evidence of cash transfers, shadow Jason during errands, and record interactions that might reveal fraudulent behavior. It was slow, meticulous work, but I needed proof, not suspicion. That afternoon, I went to the park where Jason claimed he would meet special ritual assistants to finalize the preparation. I stashed a small recorder in my pocket and walked a few paces behind. The spring sun glinted off the pond as Jason exchanged a plain envelope with a man in a dark hoodie. The subtle whisper of a transaction, the shuffle of bills, a faint cough, was captured by the recorder. My stomach tightened. $2,800 changed hands in that single exchange. The pieces were starting to fit. Returning home, I arranged the jars and candle remnants on the coffee table again, lining them up exactly as Jason had instructed. I could hear the faint echo of his muttered incantations in my memory, though the house was silent. Shadows fell across the room, stretching along the walls and ceiling. The eerie feeling that the objects themselves were alive intensified. I took another photo, comparing it with the first images I had captured, and logged every movement and anomaly in my evidence binder. Emily returned from school that afternoon, her anxiety palpable. "Dad, did you see him today?" she asked. Voice quivering, I showed her the recorded evidence and the photographs, explaining in measured tones, "I did. And this is what proves something isn't right. These jars, the powders, the rituals, they're all designed to manipulate you and me." She nodded slowly, the fear in her eyes mingled with the relief that her father was taking control. Over the next 2 days, I cataloged every interaction, every object, every discrepancy. The ledger of cash, already marked with the $50,000 payment, now included Marcus's notes, timestamps of meetings, and photographic evidence of jars moving subtly when left unattended. I began creating a timeline. May 4th, the initial payment and ritual instructions. May 5th, observations of whispering sounds and object movements. May 6th, the ritual box delivery and park cash exchange. By Monday, May 8th, 2023, I had developed a clear understanding. Jason had constructed an elaborate illusion of supernatural danger to extract money from my family. Each jar, each candle, each faint whisper had been carefully orchestrated to instill fear. And now, with Marcus documenting every public interaction, I was ready to build the case. I called my lawyer, explaining the situation and sharing photographs, voice memos, and Marcus's observations. She advised me to continue documenting meticulously, gather any witnesses, Emily's friends, neighbors, anyone who had observed Jason, and prepare for legal escalation. My mind raced with strategy. Every flicker, every shift in jars, every subtle rustle had become a weapon in our arsenal. That night I sat in the dim light of the living room, the jars arranged as before. The candle's faint smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying with it the faint scent of herbs and metallic tang. Emily slept soundly, finally able to trust in my vigilance. I reviewed the recordings of the park exchange, noting every detail of cash handling, every hand movement. My pulse steadied as I realized something crucial. Fear had been used against me, but evidence could turn the tables. I closed my notebook, each page weighted with details, photographs, and timestamps. The jars, the powders, the rituals, they would all testify in silence, and I knew that patience and precision were my allies. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the faint stirrings of control. The curse, if it existed at all, would not dominate our lives. The deception would be exposed, methodically and legally. Shadows may linger in the corners, whispers may echo in memory, but armed with evidence, I was no longer at the mercy of superstition. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a resolve solidified the next steps would be deliberate, calculated, and unyielding. Jason's confidence, his manipulation, would meet meticulous preparation. I was no longer a victim. I was becoming the architect of justice. By Tuesday, May 9th, 2023, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Shadows seemed heavier, lingering longer along the walls of the living room, stretching into corners where no light reached. I had taken over the entire investigation, photographs, voice memos, detailed notes. But the more I documented, the more I noticed subtle anomalies. Candles flickered when no draft existed. Jars shifted slightly between my returns to the living room. The faint herbal metallic scent lingered long after I had wiped the surfaces. Emily was quiet that morning, her movements deliberate, her eyes occasionally darting to the ritual setup. I could see her struggle between fear and trust. Fear from Jason's manipulation, trust in her father's promise of protection. "Dad, I keep hearing him whisper in the night," she murmured, voice hushed. I nodded, understanding the psychological toll, but also recognizing the opportunity. Her observations could serve as corroboration, a witness to the subtle manipulations Jason orchestrated. I began systematically recording every text and call from Jason. He had been careful, communicating in vague terms, peppered with ominous warnings about consequences for our family. Each message was saved, screenshots time-stamped and cataloged. Some were innocent seeming. "The rituals must be followed. Your daughter's safety is in jeopardy." Others were subtly coercive. 50,000 was only the beginning, or you must trust my guidance. The combination of threats and insinuation confirmed my growing suspicion of intentional deception. By mid-morning, I returned to the living room, where the jars sat like silent witnesses. Each one was photographed again, measured against prior images. Slight differences emerged. Liquid levels shifted. Labels appeared smudged or misaligned. One jar labeled "Barrier Blood" now tilted slightly as if nudged by an unseen hand. I snapped a photo immediately, logged the anomaly, and added it to the binder. This meticulous documentation would form the backbone of the case. The candle flickered again, a pale orange flame dancing across the walls. I leaned closer, catching the faint scent of herbs mixed with something more insidious, metallic and acrid. My pulse quickened, not fear, but anticipation. Every sensory cue became evidence. I recorded audio of the room, subtle creaks and whispers capturing ambient sounds that could be referenced later. By 2:15 p.m., Marcus, my private investigator, called with updates. Jason had been seen meeting with multiple individuals in public locations, coffee shops, small parks, and even the local pawn shop. Each encounter lasted just long enough to exchange something, possibly cash or ritual items. The surveillance photos Marcus captured were crystal clear, Jason handing a plain envelope to a man in a dark hoodie, the recipient glancing around nervously before slipping away. Each image meticulously time-stamped May 8th, 3:42 p.m., May 8th, 4:15 p.m. The details were irrefutable. I documented the evidence meticulously, photographs of jars, notes on candle placement, voice memos of subtle noises, Marcus's surveillance images, and Emily's first-hand observations. Each piece linked together, forming a chain of tangible proof. The ritual, though designed to manipulate fear, now became the instrument of Jason's exposure. That evening, Emily helped me organize everything in the living room. She carried the jars carefully, following my instructions. "Dad, it feels like they're watching me," she whispered. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They aren't, Emily. That's what he wants you to feel. But we're not afraid anymore. We're documenting. We're prepared." By 10:05 p.m., I had reviewed each recording again. I noted inconsistencies in Jason's incantations, repetitions, errors, and moments where he appeared more performative than sincere. I compared voice memos from May 4th to the present. Capturing each irregularity, each small discrepancy became a thread in the web. I was beginning to weave. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by shadows and whispers, but I found solace in the order I had established. Every call, text, photo, and note was logged. The ritual objects cataloged with exact placement, weight, and odor. The foundation of the legal case was being laid meticulously, brick by brick. In the quiet of the night, I reviewed Marcus's surveillance once more. Jason's confident demeanor in public contrasted starkly with his whispered threats at home. The duality was striking. A man performing a facade of mystical authority while leveraging fear to extract money. I realized that the same objects designed to haunt us now became tools to reveal the truth. By dawn on Wednesday, May 10th, 2023, I had prepared a binder containing photographs, audio recordings, surveillance images, timestamps of all transactions, detailed logs of ritual items, Emily's observations, and text messages from Jason. Every piece of evidence meticulously cross-referenced and dated. The shadows in the living room remained, but no longer invoked fear. They were markers of vigilance. I felt a quiet resolve. The ritual, the whispering, the shadows, and the jars, all had been weaponized against my family, but now they would serve as testimony. The game had shifted. I finally allowed myself a moment of calm, reviewing the ledger of $50,000, Marcus's notes, and the ritual box photographs. Jason's manipulation had been methodical, but so was my response. Each creak, flicker, and whisper was logged, every anomaly accounted for. I realized that fear could be documented, and deception could be exposed. The night was silent now, except for the faint rustle of paper as I finalized notes. Emily slept, reassured by my presence, while I sat at the edge of the coffee table, surrounded by jars, candles, and evidence. Shadows had not disappeared. They never would, but they no longer controlled us. We had turned them into proof. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the faint echo of Jason's voice lingered. "Your family will be safe." I smiled grimly. Safe, perhaps, but not until every shadow, every whisper, and every ritual had been exposed under the light of evidence. By Thursday, May 11th, 2023, I had gathered enough threads to start unraveling Jason's deception. The ritual box, the flickering candles, the jars labeled with cryptic names, all of it now pointed to manipulation rather than magic. My home in Atlanta felt heavier than ever, shadows pressing into corners, as though aware of the investigation unfolding under their gaze. Emily was calm but alert, sensing my determination and feeding off it. Her trust was my armor. I began the day by reviewing Marcus's surveillance footage from May 8th. Jason had met with 3 different men, each transaction brief and precise. Envelopes exchanged, subtle nods, handshakes that concealed intent. Each exchange was captured in high-resolution images, time-stamped and cross-referenced with phone records. One transaction stood out, $2,800 in cash handed to a man wearing a dark hoodie near the Piedmont Park parking lot at 3:42 p.m. I froze when I saw Jason glance around nervously, careful not to be noticed. Next, I returned to the ritual setup in my living room. Each jar, each candle, and every sheet of parchment was photographed again. I measured the weight of the jars, noting changes in liquid levels and shifts in residue patterns. The black candle, once steady, flickered violently for a brief moment as if reacting to the scrutiny. I recorded the audio of the room, capturing faint creaks and ambient noises for evidence. Even inanimate objects were now witnesses in the case I was building. By mid-afternoon, I called Emily into the living room. "I need your help documenting what you noticed," I said. She nodded, recounting in detail the whispers she had heard, the strange movements of the jars, and the sense of being watched. Every word was logged in my notebook, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with my own observations. Her statements were crucial, first-hand testimony of Jason's manipulations. Later, I confronted the ritual box itself. I compared labels, handwriting, and preparation dates. Inconsistencies were blatant. One jar's label claimed March preparation. Another April handwriting varied between jars. Powders were misaligned, some with faint smudges suggesting haste or forgery. Each discrepancy became a data point. My notebook filled with sketches, notes, and cross-references, forming a lattice of proof. By evening, I contacted my lawyer. She advised me to organize all materials, photographs of jars, audio of candles and whispering, Marcus's surveillance footage, Emily's testimony, and records of cash exchanges. Every anomaly, every subtle detail would be necessary to show premeditation and intent. I realized that Jason's confidence, his performance of ritual authority, was starting to crack under scrutiny. That night, Jason arrived unannounced. He claimed to check on Emily's well-being, but I was ready. I recorded the entire encounter. His demeanor wavered for the first time. I noticed subtle signs of discomfort, hesitation, and overconfidence cracking. Shadows danced along the walls as the black candle flickered. I placed the jars strategically on the coffee table, each one a silent witness, documenting every word he said. "Robert, I warned you," he muttered, glancing nervously at the jars. "The family, the ritual, it's serious." I nodded, voice steady. "Yes, serious enough for me to document everything, Jason. Every jar, every whisper, every transaction. Your confidence is now evidence against you." His eyes widened, flicking from candle to jar to me, realizing that the manipulation he had relied upon for fear now exposed him. I calmly presented photographs from the park, timestamps of cash transfers, audio recordings of whispered incantations, and notes on jar inconsistencies. Each piece highlighted deliberate deception, calculated manipulation, and financial exploitation. The $50,000 payment, now documented alongside Marcus's evidence, framed a clear pattern: coercion and fraud. By 11:12 p.m., I had completed the final compilation for the day. Everything was cataloged: photographs of ritual jars, timestamps of cash transfers, audio evidence, surveillance imagery, and Emily's first-hand testimony. Jason's facade had been meticulously documented. The haunting, once psychological terror was now concrete proof of fraud. I sat back on the edge of the sofa, the black candle's smoke curling into the night air. Emily slept peacefully, unaware of the storm we had harnessed into evidence. Shadows stretched along the walls, silent witnesses to our vigilance. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of control: fear transformed into proof, manipulation transformed into justice. I knew the next steps were clear: legal escalation, confrontation, and exposure. The haunting had been revealed, not as magic, but as carefully orchestrated fraud. Each jar, each whisper, each shadow would now testify in the courtroom. The tension in the house had not dissipated, but it had shifted. We were no longer victims. We were witnesses, documentarians, and strategists. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I felt a grim satisfaction. Jason's overconfidence, once a tool of fear, was now a thread I would pull to unravel his deception completely. By Friday, May 12th, 2023, the tension in our Atlanta home had escalated to a palpable, almost physical weight. Each shadow in the living room, each faint rustle of paper, and every flicker from the black candle seemed like a silent observer marking the countdown to the confrontation I had been preparing for. The ritual box, jars, and all associated artifacts had become instruments of exposure, each carefully catalogued and cross-referenced with Marcus's surveillance and Emily's first-hand observations. I began the morning by reviewing all materials once more. Marcus's park surveillance footage had been organized chronologically: May 8th, 3:42 p.m., $2,800 exchanged. May 8th, 4:15 p.m., another envelope passed discreetly to a hooded man. May 9th, 11:05 a.m., Jason observed leaving a local pawn shop carrying a small package. Each transaction was annotated with visual notes on hand positioning, body language, and surrounding environment. Every detail mattered. A single oversight could unravel the meticulous chain of evidence I had assembled. Emily remained quietly observant. Her trust in me had grown, but so had her unease. "Dad, he's going to know we're onto him," she whispered, glancing at the jars lined on the coffee table. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "Yes, Emily. And that's exactly why we have to be careful. Every detail documented, every movement noted. We are ready." I spent the mid-morning hours coordinating with my lawyer, confirming timelines, and preparing the evidence binder for eventual submission. Each photograph of jars, every audio recording of whispered incantations, and each document, Marcus's surveillance notes, receipts, text logs, was cross-checked against prior documentation. The ritual objects, once tools of fear, were now meticulously logged witnesses. Their weights, labels, liquid levels, and even faint smudges were noted. I created diagrams of placement and photographed them from multiple angles, ensuring that any subtle shift would be recorded as evidence. By early afternoon, I reviewed Jason's text messages again. Each message carried the faint undertone of coercion, subtle threats cloaked in concern, manipulative language designed to instill anxiety. The family's protection depends on following the ritual exactly, he had written. Deviation could be catastrophic. I cataloged each one, time-stamped and cross-referenced with surveillance and ritual documentation. The physical evidence was now paired with psychological insight. Jason's behavior displayed subtle tics, an arched eyebrow when I questioned him, fleeting hesitation in speech, and the occasional nervous glance toward the jars. Marcus had also captured these micro-expressions during surveillance, and I noted them carefully. Each small cue strengthened the narrative that this was a calculated exploitation of fear rather than mystical reality. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the living room, curling over the jars like dark fingers. I rehearsed the sequence of events mentally, compile the binder, coordinate with the lawyer, ensure Emily's observations were logged, and finalize Marcus's surveillance documentation. Every step had to be flawless. Any gap would compromise the case. By 7:22 p.m., I completed a final review. Each piece of evidence had been scrutinized. Photographs, timestamps, receipts, surveillance, audio recordings, and Emily's testimony. The $50,000 payment, already logged and photographed, now linked seamlessly with the surveillance of Jason's cash transfers. Every jar, candle, and parchment had been measured, photographed, and annotated with minute details. The house, once a place of fear, had become a repository of methodical preparation. Emily peeked around the corner, clutching her notebook. "Dad, it's Seps already, isn't Septed?" she asked. I smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Emily, it's Seps already. Now we wait, but waiting is part of the plan." By 10:41 p.m., I reviewed the living room one last time. The jars stood in place, the black candle's faint smoke curling toward the ceiling, and my evidence binder lay open beside me. Every whisper, every subtle shift, every shadow had been accounted for. Patience had become my weapon. Observation had become my ally. The countdown to confrontation, the moment when Jason's overconfidence would meet documented proof, was almost complete. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by shadows and echoes of whispers. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a quiet determination. The deception Jason had constructed would not withstand scrutiny. I had transformed fear into evidence, whispers into documentation, and shadows into witnesses. The game was no longer about superstition. It was about justice, preparation, and inevitability. In the dark of the night, I whispered to myself, "Every shadow is a witness. Every flicker is proof. The reckoning is coming." And for the first time I allowed myself to feel the faintest spark of control amidst the haunted tension. The storm had been contained, documented, and prepared for exposure. Jason's confidence, once a tool of fear, was now a thread that I would pull with precision. The morning of Monday, May 15th, 2023, arrived cold and clear in Atlanta. The spring air carried the faint scent of wet pavement and blooming magnolias, but inside the Fulton County Courthouse, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. I had spent the past days meticulously compiling every piece of evidence. Photographs of jars, audio recordings of whispered incantations, Marcus's surveillance footage, Emily's first-hand observations, text messages from Jason, and the ledger documenting the $50,000 payment. Every item was cataloged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. Today, all of it would be tested in the courtroom. I walked into the polished wood-paneled room, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the high ceilings. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, acknowledged me with a brief nod. Jason sat a few rows ahead, his posture rigid, hands clenched on the table, a mask of overconfidence hiding the unease I had watched him betray countless times at home. I felt a surge of calm determination. The ritual, the shadows, and the whispers all had led to this moment. I opened the evidence binder before the court clerk and began presenting the photographs of the ritual jars, each labeled, weighted, and photographed from multiple angles. The blackened candle from our living room sat at the edge of the table, a silent testament to manipulation. I explained each item's inconsistencies, labels with differing dates, handwriting variations, smudges suggesting haste, and slight shifts captured in photographs taken over successive days. The jars that had once invoked fear now testified silently against Jason. Next, I played the audio recordings of whispered incantations and the subtle rustle of the ritual objects. The courtroom was silent, the ambient noises filling the space, as if shadows themselves had been captured and brought into evidence. Every creak, every flicker, every minor sound became a part of the narrative demonstrating manipulation. Emily's face, peeking slightly behind my binder, mirrored the tension in the room, her eyes wide yet trusting. Marcus's surveillance footage was next. I guided the judge and jury through each time-stamped interaction. May 8th, 3:42 p.m. Jason handing $2,800 to a man in a dark hoodie near Piedmont Park. May 8th, 4:15 p.m. Another envelope passed discreetly. May 9th, 11:05 a.m. P. Jason leaving a pawn shop with a small package. Each frame was analyzed with every movement, glance, and hand gesture meticulously noted. It was undeniable the cash had moved in calculated patterns outside of any legitimate ritual explanation. Jason's expressions began to falter. The overconfidence I had noticed for weeks cracked under the scrutiny of law, documentation, and prepared testimony. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, flicking glances toward the jars and the ledger I had placed on the table. The $50,000 payment now linked directly to his documented exchanges, and the fraudulent ritual box framed a clear case of deception. I presented Emily's observations next, carefully guiding her through recounting whispers, jar movements, and candle flickers. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but confidence grew with each statement. I heard him whisper at night. "The jars moved, I felt watched," she said. Each detail aligned perfectly with the photographs and surveillance footage, reinforcing the narrative. The courtroom absorbed the account in near silence. The weight of tangible fear, carefully documented, made the intangible threat undeniable. Text messages from Jason were displayed on the projector. The family's protection depends on following the ritual exactly. Deviation could be catastrophic. The manipulation was clear, the intent explicit. The judge leaned forward, reviewing the screen, while Jason's attempts to interject were muted by the precision of evidence. I guided the court through the ledger of cash, the $50,000 payment on May 4th, 2023, documented receipts, envelopes, and timestamps. Each bill accounted for, each exchange verified. The narrative was airtight. Fear, ritual, and superstition had been wielded as tools for financial gain. The courtroom seemed to breathe in tandem with the evidence, shadows of manipulation illuminated by the clarity of documentation. By late afternoon, the culmination arrived. Jason was called to testify, his composure unraveling under cross-examination. I presented him with the images, timestamps, and recorded conversations, questioning each inconsistency. He stammered, denied some elements, but the evidence was overwhelming. Even the judge noted the precision with which each detail had been tracked. Jars, candles, whispers, cash movements, everything correlated. The courtroom murmurs grew as I played the last segment of Marcus's footage. Jason meeting unknown individuals in public, transferring envelopes, and conducting himself with the same deceptive poise he had used at home. The jury could see the pattern, the premeditation, the exploitation of fear. The twist, the ritual box, and its supposed mystical power, was now revealed publicly as deliberate fraud. Emily's relief was palpable. Her hand found mine, a subtle squeeze of trust and reassurance. I felt the culmination of weeks of fear, vigilance, and documentation coalesce into a moment of victory. Shadows had not disappeared entirely, but they no longer controlled the narrative. They were witnesses to justice, captured through evidence, testimony, and preparation. By 5:37 p.m., the judge adjourned the session, noting that the case's foundation was methodical, precise, and compelling. Jason's face was pale, eyes wide with the realization that the web of fear he had spun so carefully had become the instrument of his exposure. I gathered the evidence, the jars, and the ledger, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication. The haunted tension of the past 11 days had transformed into clarity, justice, and control. As we exited the courthouse, Emily beside me, I reflected silently. The shadows had been strong, the whispers convincing, and the fear nearly overwhelming. But documentation, patience, and careful observation had turned every element of manipulation into proof. Jason's overconfidence had been his undoing, and the ritual box, once a tool of terror, had become the cornerstone of justice. And in that quiet, triumphant moment, I realized fear can be captured, shadows can be documented, and deception can be dismantled. The reckoning had arrived, and we had been ready. By Tuesday, May 16, 2023, the immediate threat had dissipated. Jason had been arrested, bond posted, and the family's safety temporarily restored. Yet the shadows lingered in our Atlanta home, subtle and unyielding, a faint echo of the fear that had gripped us for nearly 2 weeks. Every flicker of candlelight and rustle of paper reminded me that the ordeal was not just about exposure, it was about reclaiming control, trust, and stability. I spent the morning reviewing the evidence one last time before handing it over to the authorities and my lawyer. Photographs of jars, surveillance footage, text messages, voice recordings, and timestamps were meticulously catalogued. Even the ritual box, now inert and harmless, was photographed, labeled, and included in the submission. The black candle, once a symbol of dread, sat quietly on the table, smoke long since dissipated, yet its memory still carried weight. Emily moved about the house, quiet but alert, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the jars that had once haunted her nights. Dad, do you think he'll come back? She asked softly, clutching a notebook where she had documented her observations. I reassured her, he won't, Emily. Everything is documented and the authorities are handling it. The shadows may linger, but they no longer control us. She nodded slowly, understanding the gravity and relief entwined in my words. That afternoon, Marcus delivered additional surveillance photographs confirming Jason's movements after the initial park exchanges. Each image aligned with the timeline we had built. May 12th, 3:21 p.m. Him leaving a convenience store with a small unmarked package. May 13th, 1:14 p.m. A brief meeting at a local cafe with someone I had never seen before. These final pieces were cross-referenced and added to the growing archive of evidence. I took the time to organize the ritual box in a manner that mirrored its original arrangement, documenting its contents with precise measurements and detailed photographs. The jars, powders, and candle remnants were catalogued, weights and labels verified, and every anomaly recorded. The binder, now comprehensive, reflected weeks of observation, careful note-taking, and methodical documentation. Each entry marked the culmination of strategic vigilance and deliberate patience. In the early evening, a faint flicker of sunlight through the blinds cast elongated shadows across the living room floor. I paused, realizing how much the house itself had become a character in this ordeal. Shadows, whispers, and subtle movements had been carefully noted, serving as both instruments of fear and now as silent witnesses to proof. I recorded a voice memo, noting every observation, every anomaly, and every emotion. Even the faint metallic scent lingering from the ritual box was captured in description. Emily joined me as I reviewed the binder, tracing her finger along the photographs and surveillance stills. It's like we turned fear into proof, she said softly. I nodded, affirming her insight. Exactly, Emily. Every shadow, every whisper, every candle and jar, they've all become evidence. That's how we reclaim control. By nightfall, the living room was quiet. The ritual box safely stored, photographs filed, and the ledger meticulously annotated. The tension of the past 2 weeks had eased, replaced by a calculated calm. I could finally breathe, knowing the evidence was comprehensive, the legal process underway, and the family's safety largely secured. As I looked around the room, the black candle now inert, the jars silent, and Emily's notebook closed, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. The shadows remained, but they no longer held power over us. We had documented, observed, and endured. The deception had been revealed, the fraud exposed, and the groundwork laid for justice to prevail. That night, I allowed myself a brief rest, aware that the courtroom battle had shifted into its next phase. but within the calm I felt the faint echo of prior fear, a reminder that vigilance, documentation, and patience had been our most powerful allies. The haunted tension had transformed into structured evidence, and in that transformation the first real sense of closure had begun. By Wednesday, May 17th, 2023, the courthouse seemed almost serene compared to the tense days we had endured at home. The spring air carried a faint warmth, filtered sunlight spilling across polished floors, yet inside the atmosphere remained charged. Today, restitution would be addressed, and the fruits of meticulous preparation, documentation, and patience would be formally recognized. I arrived early, clutching the comprehensive evidence binder, photographs of jars, detailed notes on candle flickers, voice recordings of whispered incantations, Marcus's surveillance images, Emily's testimony, and text message logs from Jason. Each document had been reviewed multiple times, ensuring that every anomaly, every manipulation, and every detail aligned perfectly with the timeline. Jason sat a few rows ahead, visibly tense. Gone was the overconfident posture of earlier hearings. His gaze shifted nervously, flicking toward the jars and ledger I had brought for display. The $50,000 payment, meticulously documented, rested in the evidence binder, now a tangible symbol of his attempted fraud. The judge began by reviewing the case, acknowledging the thorough preparation and detailed evidence compilation. I presented the ledger first, walking through the exact $50,000 payment made on May 4th, 2023, corroborated with receipts, bank slips, and timestamps. Each dollar, each note accounted for, leaving no ambiguity. Next, I displayed the photographs of the ritual box and jars, highlighting inconsistencies, smudged handwriting, varying preparation dates, and subtle shifts observed over successive days. The court listened intently, the object's silent testimony speaking volumes. Shadows had once been a source of fear. Now they reinforced the clarity of methodical documentation. Marcus's surveillance footage was projected, detailing Jason's meetings and cash exchanges. May 8th, 3:42 p.m. $2,800 transferred to an unidentified man. May 8th, 4:15 p.m. Another envelope passed discreetly. May 9th, 11:05 a.m. A package retrieved from a pawn shop. Each frame was annotated, and timestamps aligned perfectly with the ledger and photographs. Jason's manipulation was now irrefutable. Emily's testimony followed. Calm and composed, she recounted whispered voices, subtle jar movements, and faint candle flickers. I felt watched. The jars moved when no one was there. I kept notes, she said. Her voice trembled slightly, but her confidence grew as I guided her through the details. Every account she gave corroborated my photographs, recordings, and surveillance evidence, strengthening the chain of proof. Finally, I presented the audio recordings of whispered incantations, faint creaks, and ambient sounds from the ritual. The court listened carefully, hearing the same patterns I had meticulously logged over days. Every whisper, every candle flicker, every subtle movement had been captured and aligned with other evidence. The room seemed to hold its breath as the intangible fear Jason had wielded was transformed into undeniable proof of manipulation and fraud. By mid-afternoon, the judge reviewed restitution options. The documents and evidence binder were referenced repeatedly, highlighting Jason's deliberate coercion and exploitation. Each observation from the house, each detailed note, and each time-stamped interaction confirmed a pattern. Jason had manipulated fear for financial gain. As the court formally ordered restitution, signed receipts of returned funds were presented. The $50,000, once a source of anxiety and fear, was returned, documented, and verified. Relief washed over me as the moral order was restored. Emily's grip on my hand tightened slightly, her eyes reflecting the satisfaction of justice served. Leaving the courthouse, I felt a rare clarity. Shadows remained, faint echoes of the haunting past, but the deception that had leveraged them had been dismantled. The ritual box, jars, and whispers, once sources of fear, had become evidence in the light. Justice had been realized, patience rewarded, and vigilance vindicated. By evening, the Atlanta sky glowed softly with the setting sun. I returned home with Emily, the evidence binder now resting safely on the study table. every photograph, recording, and note meticulously stored. The haunting, the manipulation, the fear, they were all captured, analyzed, and now extinguished through legal reckoning. Sitting quietly in the living room, I reflected on the journey. Each shadow had once loomed large, each whisper had once caused sleepless nights, and each jar had once been a vessel of fear. Now those same elements had illuminated the truth, proving that meticulous observation, careful documentation, and unwavering patience could transform fear into justice. By Thursday, May 18th, 2023, the courthouse drama had ended, yet the house still whispered reminders of the fear we had endured. Atlanta's spring air was warm and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of magnolias and freshly cut grass. Shadows clung to the corners of the living room, long after the black candle had been extinguished, and the jars of the ritual box rested inert, silent witnesses to weeks of meticulous observation and documentation. I sat in the living room, the evidence binder open before me, reviewing each page. Photographs of jars, voice recordings of whispered incantations, Marcus's surveillance footage, Emily's notes, and the ledger of the $50,000 payment. The narrative was complete, and the truth irrefutable. Every shadow, every flicker, every subtle movement that had once inspired terror, now served as a testament to diligence, patience, and vigilance. Emily perched beside me, flipping through her notebook, tracing the timeline of events she had observed. "Dad, it feels like we survived the ghosts," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe. I smiled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not just the ghosts, Emily. We survived fear, manipulation, and deception, and we documented everything. Evidence made the shadows powerless." The evening light cast a soft glow on the living room walls, shadows stretching and shifting gently as if breathing alongside us. I allowed myself to reflect on the emotional journey, the initial gut punch of Jason's claim, the sleepless nights, the anxious whispers, and the subtle movements of the ritual box. Every detail had been carefully logged, cross-referenced, and transformed into proof of deception and fraud. I recalled the $50,000 payment, once a source of panic and anxiety, now returned and verified, documented thoroughly in the ledger. Marcus's surveillance photographs had revealed every transaction and meeting Jason conducted in public. Emily's notes provided first-hand insight into the psychological manipulation he employed. Each element had been transformed from fear into actionable evidence, culminating in restitution and legal accountability. I took a deep breath, letting the calm settle over me. The shadows no longer held power over our home. They existed only as memories of what had been overcome. The ritual box, jars, powders, and black candle, all once instruments of manipulation, had now become symbols of resilience, careful observation, and methodical action. In the quiet, I reflected on family, loyalty, and calculated courage. The ordeal had tested not only my resolve, but also my ability to transform fear into justice. Emily's trust had anchored me, guiding each step of documentation and preparation. And now, in the aftermath, I understood the deeper lesson: vigilance and patience could convert the intangible weight of fear into the concrete certainty of truth. I whispered to myself, a quiet aphorism that summed the journey: "You didn't lose me, you gave me away." The words resonated, a mantra of endurance, reflection, and the protective love that had guided every action. The shadows, faint and lingering, reminded me that fear could never be fully erased, but with careful documentation, deliberate strategy, and unwavering vigilance, it could be neutralized and transformed into justice. That night, as the house settled into silence, I reviewed the evidence one final time. Every photograph, audio recording, and handwritten note was meticulously filed. Marcus's surveillance tapes were labeled, indexed, and secured. Emily's observations were highlighted and cross-referenced. The ledger of cash, previously a source of dread, was now a symbol of accountability. The black candle's remnants on the coffee table were carefully placed beside the ritual box, inert but ever present. Its faint scent lingered, a reminder of past fear transformed into triumph. Shadows stretched along the walls, but they no longer signified threat. They were echoes of vigilance, love, and justice. I looked at Emily, smiling softly. The haunting had ended, the deception revealed, and the family's trust restored. And in that quiet reflection, I understood fully fear, like shadows, could linger, but love, patience, and careful preparation would always outlast it. By Friday, May 19th, 2023, the house in Atlanta felt alive again, not with shadows or whispered fears, but with the quiet, comforting rhythm of normal life. The spring air filtered through the windows, carrying the faint scent of magnolias and warm asphalt, a gentle reminder that the world outside had continued while we endured our ordeal. Emily laughed as she prepared breakfast, her youthful energy filling the kitchen. The ritual box, jars, and black candle, once sources of dread, had been safely stored in a locked cabinet, untouched and now symbolic of a past fear transformed into triumph. The sunlight poured across the countertop, illuminating the evidence binder I had compiled, reminding me of the meticulous work that had turned shadows into proof, whispers into documentation, and fear into justice. I joined her at the table, sipping coffee and observing the simplicity of domestic routine. The tension that had gripped the past weeks had dissipated, replaced with relief and an almost cinematic calm. Emily recounted a humorous story from school, the kind that would have once been lost in anxiety or fear. Her laughter was infectious, resonating through the rooms that had once felt oppressive with shadow. I glanced at the binder beside me, filled with photographs, timestamps, and surveillance images. Every jar, every subtle shift, every whisper recorded over the past 2 weeks had been crucial in exposing Jason's deception. And yet, in this moment, all of that meticulous preparation felt like a quiet triumph rather than a burden. The evidence was complete, but the focus now was healing and restoration. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the blinds, casting moving shadows across the walls. I caught a glimpse of the black candle and the jars, silent witnesses to our ordeal, but they no longer evoked fear. They were reminders of what vigilance, patience, and careful documentation could achieve. Shadows had once been ominous, whispers menacing. Now they were echoes of triumph, transformed into a testament of resilience. Emily set her plate down and smiled. "Dad, it feels like everything is finally normal again," she said. I nodded, realizing that the ordinary moments, the aroma of breakfast, the sunlight on the counter, the sound of her laughter, were now victories in themselves. The fear that had once dominated our home had been dismantled, replaced by a newfound security and trust. I moved to the living room, placing the ritual box and black candle in their locked cabinet. Each photograph, audio recording, and note was carefully returned to the evidence binder, cataloged and stored. Marcus's surveillance footage, the ledger of $50,000, Emily's notes, all were organized for any eventuality. Yet the tension that had necessitated them had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction. The day passed slowly, with ordinary activities taking center stage. Emily read a book in the sunlit living room, the jars and candle casting harmless shadows across the floor. I worked on small repairs in the house, enjoying the tangible, grounding tasks that had been absent during the weeks of tension. Laughter replaced whispers. Sunlight replaced the oppressive shadows of fear. As evening approached, I stood by the window, watching the Atlanta skyline bathe in golden light. The lingering sense of vigilance remained, a subtle reminder of lessons learned, but the oppressive weight of fear had lifted. Emily's laughter echoed from the kitchen, blending with the distant sounds of the city. The haunting, once central to our lives, had been transformed into an experience of learning, resilience, and ultimately relief. In the quiet, I reflected the shadows had tested us, but laughter had reclaimed our home. Fear had been confronted, documented, and transformed into evidence. Manipulation had been exposed and justice had been delivered. The ritual box, jars, and black candle would remain stored, but their power had shifted. They were no longer instruments of fear, but artifacts of triumph. That night, as Emily slept peacefully in her room, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, listening to the soft hum of the house. The sun had set, but warmth remained, both from the day and the knowledge that fear had been overcome, and laughter had returned to our lives. The home, once haunted by shadows and whispered manipulation, was finally alive again. By Saturday, May 20th, 2023, the Atlanta morning was calm and warm, the spring sunlight spilling across the driveway and through the windows. The house felt lighter, freer, yet the shadows from previous days seemed to linger faintly along corners and walls. a gentle reminder of the trials we had endured. The ritual box, jars, and black candle remained safely stored in the locked cabinet, their presence now symbolic rather than threatening. That afternoon, a small envelope arrived at the workshop door. I opened it carefully. Inside was a thank you card from another family who had heard about Jason's fraudulent rituals through local news coverage. The card's paper was thick and slightly textured, sunlight catching the gold lettering as I held it in my hands. The handwriting was neat, personal, and heartfelt. Your diligence and courage protected more than your own family. Thank you for showing us the truth. Emily peered over my shoulder, eyes wide with curiosity. Dad, they really believe it? She asked softly. I nodded. Yes, Emily. The truth has ripple effects. Our vigilance not only protected us, but helped others avoid the same fear. Her face reflected awe and pride, and I felt a warmth that was both relief and affirmation. I placed the card carefully on the workshop table, sunlight illuminating the words. Around it, the black candle's remnants and the jars of the ritual box cast long, inert shadows. The lingering presence was subtle, a reminder of the past, but their power had shifted. They were now silent witnesses to evidence, courage, and justice achieved. I reviewed the evidence binder one last time. Photographs, timestamps, audio recordings, surveillance footage, Emily's notes, and the $50,000 ledger. Each page told a story of patience, observation, and meticulous documentation. Each shadow, whisper, and flicker of the ritual box had been captured and converted into proof. The haunting that once ruled our home was now preserved as lessons learned and justice served. Marcus called that evening, confirming that authorities had received the full set of documentation and would continue monitoring Jason. Everything is airtight, Robert, he said. Your thoroughness will make sure this ends cleanly. I exhaled, the tension of the past weeks releasing in a long, measured breath. The shadows remained, yes, but they were powerless. Fear had been replaced with structured vigilance. Emily and I stood by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the workshop, casting moving patterns on the floor. I reflected on the journey. Initial terror, sleepless nights, whispered manipulations, subtle shifts of jars and candles, and the painstaking collection of proof. Every detail had mattered, every observation had contributed, and the culmination had been justice. I touched the ritual box lightly, reverently. It was no longer an instrument of fear, it was a reminder that meticulous preparation, patience, and courage could transform terror into empowerment. Shadows and whispers, once tools of deception, had become silent monuments to diligence and resilience. In the quiet, I allowed a final reflection. The ripple of our vigilance had extended beyond our home, beyond the $50,000 fraud, and into the wider community. Fear could linger, shadows could stretch long, but with documentation, strategy, and protective resolve, deception could be dismantled, justice could be served, and love could prevail. As the sun set over Atlanta, I placed the thank you card beside the locked cabinet. The faint shadows of the ritual box stretched across the floor, no longer threatening, only echoing the lessons learned. I looked at Emily and whispered, "We did what was right. And now the final haunt is behind us.